No, at home. I said I take them home for during Lent.
Oh, good.
So I thought,
They love it. And you love it. You know,
yes.
they're like their little trophies.
Yeah, and they know flowers. That's why we really appreciate it. It's one of the joys of Easter. Flowers.
Yep. But hey,
You can watch it. It's been live streamed, so you can watch it.
no.
But I mean, one reason people are watching it might be that they're watching it. They love it. No, this.
You're watching this on the news?
No, not on the news, but on our Facebook feed.
Oh, it's on. It's very
It's been,
I do have a no, it's right.
medicine. Yes, it's sacrifice. And that's when you can get it. I think it would be very easy.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for your prayers. Thanks for the actions. But my situation is
It's nice to see the church.
Well, it is Madison. People will be sneaking in for the next half hour. So, I want to welcome everybody who's on YouTube, who's also watching this. We have several people watching. I already looked, and to see that our YouTube channel is up and running. And I want to thank you and welcome everyone to Blessed Sacrament Parish. Thank you for coming and to be a part of this incredible evening of an incredible talk with refreshments. There will be a Q&A after each talk. So hang on, I have a handheld microphone I'll have ready so that everybody here and at home can hear the questions and to have them be responded to. And then we'll just continue on in refreshments for a little gathering back in the entryway of the church, our gathering space, after our final talk and final QA. Restrooms are through that door downstairs, and then there's one right out here to handicap accessible, also through the elevator. But so through these two doors, just downstairs, you will find the restrooms if you need them. And again, thank you for coming, and I would like to, our three speakers this evening on this second day of Lent. As we enter into this holy season, we address a very important subject, Roe from three angles, law, language, and looking ahead. Our speakers are Cecilia Klingel, and she's an associate professor at UW Law, Linda Kelly, who is a parishioner, a lifelong learner, educator, writer, and lover of language, with a BA from Indiana University and an MA from Benedictine University. And her son Patrick Kelly is a pro-life advocate and a senior software engineer with a love of history that he brings to this discussion. And they will tell you more about themselves in their individual talks. But first, I would like to introduce Cecilia Klingel. Again, she is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Her academic research focuses on criminal justice system administration with an emphasis on sentencing and corrections. After receiving her JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School, Professor Klingel served as a law clerk at three federal judges, including Associate Justice John Paul Stevens of the United States Supreme Court. She returned to UW-Madison in 2009 as a member of the law school faculty. Professor Klingel and her husband Brad are members of Good Shepherd Parish and the parents of 11 children, or as I like to see, a football team, and 2 grandchildren at least. Is there more than that? Where did she go? Oh, just the 2? Okay. We see them at church here very often as her daughter and her husband come here, attend here. So please welcome Cecilia Klingel.
Hello. It is a delight to be with you this evening. As I told Susanna, I'm going to give you a disclaimer here. You heard in my bio, I am not a specialist in constitutional law. It's not what I generally do, unless we're talking about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments, in which case I could talk all day, and actually do talk all day. But I certainly I'm familiar with this topic. It's one that has been close to my heart for many, many years, and one on which I often find that people of faith have only sort of a passing understanding when it comes to the legal ramifications of the abortion laws in the United States. So I want to talk today, I'm told I have about 20 minutes, which for a law professor is like 20 seconds. But I'm going to do my best to be succinct and still to give you a little bit of substance when it comes to understanding the constitutional laws that are at issue, particularly in the case that is currently before the court that is attracting all of the media and public attention, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. And to do that, what I need to do is sort of briefly summarize for you the 2 key controlling Supreme Court cases on this issue, one of which you have certainly heard of, Roe versus Wade, which was decided in 1973. The other of which, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, was decided in 1992. And those 2 cases really provide for us the legal framework for how the Supreme Court approaches the question of abortion rights and abortion access in the United States. I'm going to talk about what that framework looks like, so you're going to get a super speedy con law here. And then I want to talk about what that means for state laws, should it be the case that the Roe and Casey framework falls away. What would that mean legally? So let me begin this way. Many people understand that Roe versus Wade was a decision that talked about abortion as being protected by the Constitution because women have a right to privacy in certain kinds of medical decisions, of which the court included abortion. It's important to step back from that and understand a little bit in greater depth where that right to privacy comes from. What does it mean? I know when I was growing up and hearing this issue talked about, I heard a lot of people saying, there's no right to privacy in the Constitution, that's made up. Right? Well, it is true that the Constitution doesn't have any text that says that there is a right to privacy in those words. It's important to notice there are a lot of rights that we recognize that don't find their words in the Constitution. I'm teaching Miranda this week in my criminal procedure class, and I ask everyone, where do we find those Miranda rights in the Constitution? Oh, right, they're not there. No, they're not. The court has interpreted them, but they can't just interpret them out of thin air. That would be completely illegitimate. The court instead grounds its analysis in text of the Constitution and extrapolates from there. So, although several constitutional arguments were made in the Roe v. Wade case, it was one that really won the day. And that was the argument that the 14th Amendment's protection for what we call due process of law reserved for people certain spaces that were free from government intrusion. What? That sounds like law professor talk. I know, so let me try it a different way. When we talk about due process of law, that's a phrase that it's not self-defining, right? We have to explain what it means. And in law, we treat due process as having two components. One, the easier one to understand, is what we call procedural due process. So that's just a fair process to decide things. That's the requirement that we give you notice before we make behavior criminal, for example, or that you get to have a judge decide certain issues in a case that's being litigated. Right? That's procedural due process. And we have lots of rights that find their grounding in the 14th Amendment's procedural due process clause. Just to make it extra complicated, the Fifth Amendment has one too. Put together, they make sure that both the states and the federal government honor your due process rights. But there's a second kind of due process that's invoked less frequently, is more complicated, is a greater subject of jurisprudential debate, and that is the second, and we call that substantive due process. Substantive due process is the idea that there are some kinds of decisions and behaviors and liberties that we have as individuals that no amount of process can justify the court interfering with. I have heard sometimes within the pro-life community people maligning the idea of substantive due process because it's kind of arbitrary, right? Like it's amorphous. What are its limits? Like how, if it's not grounded in the text of the Constitution, how do we define what it is? That is a definite challenge, for sure. And many of the court's substantive due process decisions have reached outcomes that sometimes people of faith don't like, particularly in areas involving sexuality. It's also important, though, I think really, really important, for people to remember that substantive due process protects a lot of rights that people of faith really value. So, for example, the right to marry whom we choose, the right to have children, the right to raise our children as we wish, to educate them as we wish. Those are all decisions that, when litigated, have been decided based on substantive due process considerations. So I think fundamentally that idea that there are some things the government just doesn't get to mess with, that seems to me less controversial than the harder question of what exactly falls within that sphere. Right? What are those things that the government can and can't regulate? Over the course of the years that led up to the Roe decision in 1973, the Supreme Court had already begun to talk about some issues of relationships and sexuality as being protected from criminalization by the government under substantive due process analysis. This included, most famously probably, the right of couples to procure birth control, right? And when this case came up to the court, again, the argument that ended up getting the most traction was this idea that although the court acknowledged in a very, very, very long opinion that you always know the court feels like it's saying something important when you start out in like ancient Greece and Rome and then move forward, right? It's this feeling of the opinion, right? That they know they're treading into difficult territory and they want to say something big. So it traces the history of different treatments of abortion under law in different eras and different cultures. In the end, the actual analysis under the 14th Amendment is kind of short and cursory, and simply just says, well, here are all these other areas that we have said are protected. This one sure seems like those, at least as private. And here in Roe, we really see that idea of substantive due process being reduced to the sense of spheres of privacy in which the government is not supposed to interfere. And the court saying, gee, we don't really know that much about this. People disagree really deeply about it. It seems like a decision that really needs to belong to a woman and to her doctor. But the court didn't exactly stop there. Even in Roe, the court conceded that there is a point somewhere during gestation where the state does incur an interest in its future citizens, and that therefore we know, this is true of constitutional law generally, that even when you have a right, an important right, when there is a compelling state interest that affects that right, the government can, under some circumstances, regulate, restrict, limit, shape, cabin in some way your exercise of that right. And so the court in Roe acknowledged that that could occur at some point. In trying to decide what that looked like, we're in 1973, and you have to remember that not only were we in 1973, but that courts are notorious for being far, far behind science in terms of our understanding of science. So whatever is cutting edge today, like expect in 10 to 15 years, the court will be ready to catch up to whatever governing scientists would say is true. So understandings of fetal development, while in existence certainly, were a little more limited. And again, remember, these are lawyers trying to interpret science. We're not real good at that sometimes. And so Roe takes this very formulaic division of state interest divided by the trimesters of pregnancy, saying the state sort of has more interest the further along you go. Even those who supported the Roe versus Wade decision tended to critique almost immediately that particular way in which the court approached this question. It never was particularly satisfactory. It didn't match science. It didn't match lived experience. And it didn't make a ton of sense. But it started and it held for some time, in fact, for 20 years, until in 1992, we saw Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was a case that challenged state attempts to restrict abortion access. Casey was asked, in Casey, the court was asked to consider a number of different kinds of restrictions that states had placed on abortion access, including parental consent laws, waiting periods. There was a husband notification provision that was at issue as well. And they were asked to sort of delve deeper into this question of how do you balance this right that the court had recognized in Roe against this compelling state interest that exists in the health and well-being of citizens, including those who aren't here yet but are well on their way. And so what the court did there was it tried to create a new framework that was a little more sophisticated, only a little, but a little more sophisticated than the Roe framework, and also told us what standard courts were to use when reviewing abortion restrictions. They were urged to develop a strict scrutiny standard, which would have made it very, very hard for regulations to pass muster. That's the highest level of review that we give. Instead, what they did in Casey was end up adopting what's called an undue burden standard, in which the court now looks at restrictions that are placed on abortion access and asks whether they unduly burden the ability of a woman to exercise the right that was named in Roe versus Wade. Well, if undue seems like a kind of vague word to you, welcome to constitutional analysis, right? Again, I teach the Fourth Amendment, which is about reasonableness, right? We often in constitutional law use these standards that are really amorphous because what we're trying to do isn't dictate particular outcomes, but to give guiding principles that are flexible for courts to use in analyzing specific factual cases that may come before them. The undue burden standard was seen by most people in the pro-life movement as a step forward because it made it more likely that governments were going to be able to place some parameters around access to abortion, particularly later in pregnancy. In Casey, the court moved away from a trimester framework and toward a viability framework. Now, at the time of Casey, we did not have the advancements we've had in neonatal medicine, and so children were reaching ages of viability later than they are now. But it is still true that there's a distinction to be made there, right? As the ages of viability continues to get younger and younger, the court still looks to that as a touchstone. Although it said that states could place restrictions in some cases on access to abortion, they also, however, placed restrictions on the restrictions. So they said that it would not be permissible for states to restrict access. If in doing so, the enforcement of those restrictions was going to affect the health of a mother, and health was given a fairly broad definition by later courts developing that concept. That's the framework, right? And so Dobbs is coming before the court now as a challenge to laws that are prohibiting, with very, very few exceptions, access to abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. 15 weeks is still not viable under today's standards. A child born at 15 weeks would not be able to survive, even with medical intervention. And so this sets up a revisiting of the Casey and potentially also the Roe case itself. Right? It's presenting a question the court has purported to answer, and so really what we are doing now is re-examining precedent. The court re-examines precedent a lot. I think people don't appreciate that always. Almost every term, something gets overruled. I can think of several cases where the court was asked to overrule something in the term that I spent there, and at least one case in which we did. There is an established protocol for considering when the court should set aside prior precedent. And the kinds of considerations that go into that decision are ones about whether the old rule was administrable, right? Does it work? Does it give enough clarity? Is it effective? Considerations of reliance, so how much would it upend the legal system or people's lives if it were to be changed? And then, I think importantly, whether the decision was right? Whether we have reasons to believe that in fact the older decision was based on misinformation or misinterpretation or is inconsistent with the way in which we see the legal questions that are presented today. Those are all going to be questions that the court is actively wrestling with. The decision in the case, we don't know when it will come out. Typically, the harder or more controversial a decision is, the more writing will be done to prepare for it. Separate writings often are common in big cases, and because that takes time, those cases usually come out at the end of the Supreme Court's term, which usually is at the end of June. So we tend to see a whole bunch of opinions come out in June, sort of serially, with the blockbuster cases tending to issue pretty late in the day. That's not always true, but it's usually the pattern that we see followed. The court tends to wrap up its term at the end of June. I think one time it was early July, but then the Supreme Court goes on recess, so you will see a decision reasonably soon. Before I end, I did want to say something, though, about what will happen. Right? Well, we don't know what the opinion says, so I can't tell the future. Of course, the court could simply say that the status quo remains. They could tweak the tests that are used. But it is also possible that the court could, in fact, overrule Casey and or Roe. And I think the important takeaway here is what that would actually mean. Because I've had many conversations with non-lawyers who think that that means that abortion would be barred in the United States of America. That is not the case. What it would mean for those cases to be overturned is that we would no longer say that the United States Constitution gives a woman a constitutional right under the 14th Amendment to access abortion. That's actually a pretty limited holding, because there are lots of other sources of law that we rely on that could speak to that question. The sort of next down in the tier of legal hierarchy would be state constitutional provisions. So every state has its own constitution. Many of them resemble the federal constitution, and many state high courts interpret their provisions to match the interpretation the Supreme Court gives the federal constitution. But they don't have to, and there are notable examples. States can always give citizens more protection under the Constitution, they just can't give them less protection. So if you're looking at this from the perspective of the woman, and that's what the court is going to do, because the courts throughout the nation look at the legal interests of people who are born. We don't give the same status to those who are unborn. And so litigation and rights would be a conversation about women. And from that perspective, states that chose to have a more expansive interpretation of their own due process rights would be permitted to do so without contradicting any narrower interpretation by the U.S. Supreme Court. That's important to know. The other thing that's important to know is that many states, whether or not they grant constitutional protection, have statutes on the books, many drafted before Roe versus Wade and simply never removed, that do make abortion illegal. Some of them are criminal provisions, some have civil sanctions, some are addressed to women, some are addressed to abortion medical providers. It is important to know what those are in one state, because certainly the status of those laws is not consistent with the way people often look at the abortion question, whether they are pro-life or pro-choice, particularly criminalization provisions for women in crisis. So those are important things to consider as well. And then finally, people often ask me, well, what if we wanted to give protection to unborn children? The answer there is actually legally pretty simple. Practically much harder, and that's that you would need to amend constitutions, state constitutions, federal constitutions. That's what it would take to get constitutional protection. You would have to redefine and expand the scope of the definition of who is protected. And there certainly are always efforts underway to think about the scope of who is protected. I think actually one of the probably most better known attempts are those attempts, not so much in the United States, but sometimes in other countries as well. You hear about attempts to expand rights for natural resources, right, or for animals, to give standing for litigation that would be brought in the interests of those entities, right? And so thinking about the unborn, it would be a similar expansion of who has standing to come before our courts that would be needed if that were the legal angle that you were interested in taking. So I feel like I probably talked too long. I may have bored you, but I hope at least a couple people are on my side. You get a cookie afterward. I hope, however, that that's a helpful way to just let you understand how lawyers and judges are looking at these questions when it comes to the legal standards that apply. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Cecilia. And thank you all for being here. I think we can all agree that Our number one tool to use in our efforts to end abortion is prayer. So if you wouldn't mind joining me now in a short one. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. Blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us now and at the hour of our death. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. So if the first tool is prayer, I think the second most valuable tool in our toolbox is language. The very words that we choose to say or not to say are extremely powerful. And actually, when you think about it, when we pray, we just used words then too. John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word. Well, I'm certainly not an expert on language, but I've always been fascinated with it, so much so that most all of my professional positions and volunteer activities over the years have involved writing, kind of experimenting with the magic of and the power of words. So, language as a tool. Obviously, we need to think carefully about the words we use when talking to other people, but first, we must be brutally honest about the words we use to talk to ourselves. Humans need words to hang their thoughts on. The thoughts that we think inform the words that we choose, but more often and more importantly, the words we use when talking to ourselves inform the thoughts we think and the opinions that we form. And the more we say the words, the more we believe the words. And that's how we're able to lie to ourselves and get away with it. Notice I call prayer and language tools, not weapons, because many words come loaded with a lot of emotional baggage. If someone shows up at your house and you open the door and they have a weapon, we're going to slam the door in their face and call the police. But if someone shows up at your door with tools, you're going to be delighted and welcome them in, and you're glad they're finally there to fix your kitchen sink. So we need to keep the doors open if we want to communicate. In discussing any controversial, emotional issue, we shouldn't approach it as if it's a battle to be won. Rather, as Bishop Robert Barron has repeatedly warned us, the approach should always be to walk with others in seeking the truth. That's a big difference. And on that journey of seeking and hopefully finding the truth, we must agree to use the denotation and not the connotation of words. If one person has redefined key words in a discussion, well then how can you effectively communicate? Understanding is lost. The truth can only be discovered with truthful language. But of course, then here's the real challenge. You must package and deliver truthful language in a loving, non-judgmental way, or the door to communicate will be slammed in our faces. About 30 years ago, we were living in suburban Chicago, and we made a weekend getaway to the Wisconsin Dells, to a water park, and on the way home, we stopped at a trout farm. The older kids were around 8 and 10, and the youngest, Bridget, was about 3 or 4. Well, the older two, Patrick and Heather, really got into the fishing for and catching of the fish, and they knew full well that was going to be our dinner. But Bridget was oblivious to all that. She just stood by the side of the pond, throwing in cracker crumbs, just delighted at the cute little fishies, and they were gobbling up her treat. Well, later that night, back at home, my husband Dave fired up the grill to cook our catch, but when we sat down to eat, Bridget said, I want some of that chicken. Well, we told her it wasn't chicken, it was the fish that we had caught that day. She was horrified and refused to eat. But after a brief period of us all raving about how delicious the trout was, she chimed in again with, I want some of that chicken. Well, without saying anything, I put some fish on her plate, she tasted it, and then she said, that is good chicken. So the story illustrates how early we learn this practice of self-deception, using words. A practice we continue to employ and perfect as we become adults. As a result, many people today call themselves pro-choice because they really, deep down, in good conscience, can't say they're pro-abortion. They may insist on saying clump of cells instead of the true words, a small human being in his or her earliest, most vulnerable stage of development. They can't use those words to themselves. They use the words terminate a pregnancy, but they cannot in good conscience say murder an unborn child. 3 days ago, the U.S. Senate defeated a bill called the Women's Health Protection Act, which, if enacted, would enshrine abortion on demand through the 9th month of pregnancy in every state of this country. If truthful, accurately descriptive language had been used in naming this bill, it would have been called the Abortion Protection Bill. But no, it was called the Women's Health Protection Bill, as if pregnancy and childbirth, it's a deadly disease and all women have a right to be protected from it. And incidentally, of the 46 senators who supported that bill, 16 are Catholic. The accepted definition worldwide of the word murder is, quote, the intentional taking of an innocent life. To substitute the word kill for the word murder is a deceptive attempt to soften the stance. You kill a houseplant if you overwater it. If your car skids on the ice and you cause the fatality of another driver, well, you kill that driver, but you don't murder him. There is no other word which truthfully, accurately defines and describes abortion except the word murder. The intentional taking of an innocent life. You can squabble about the word baby, but it's life, it's human, and it's life, and it's innocent. When you're about 12 months old, the first word almost all of you probably said was dada. For some reason, it's never mama. I don't know why. And the second word you learned was no doubt, you want to guess? What would it be? No. Correct. The word no. And it was a word you used with great frequency and great emotion. It was the most powerful tool in your toddler toolbox for quite a while. And the word no is still extremely powerful. While we parents learned very early on to avoid letting the word no trigger a tantrum in the middle of the pick and save cereal aisle, we learned to offer a choice. Do you want Rice Krispies or Cheerios? And instead of put your coat on, we said, do you want to wear your blue jacket or your red sweater? The decision about which cereal to have in the morning was your choice. And it was perfectly okay, because whichever you chose, the Rice Krispies or the Cheerios, you got a healthy breakfast. And whether you chose the blue jacket or the red sweater, you'd be warm. So for generations now, we have nurtured the notion that to have choices is not only good, it's mandatory. I know you heard it in the last week a half dozen times in media coverage over whom Biden would nominate for the Supreme Court. We heard politicians say, and I quote, A woman's right to choose is her constitutional right. And if we are using honest language, we would be discussing this whole issue as, should abortion be legal or illegal? But instead, we use dishonest language and we frame the issue as, are you pro-life or pro-choice? There's that word again, choice. So it's been framed as if it's a valid choice between two valid options. Do you want to go to UW or IU for grad school? Do you want to watch Netflix Saturday night or go to the movie theater? Do you want to continue your pregnancy or do you want to end it? Either way, both options are fine because it's your choice. I recently suggested to a group of high school students a possible response to the argument, my body, my choice. Well, how about leading with an affirmation of sorts, using their language? Yes, you might say, you definitely have the choice to control your body. And isn't it great that women today have so many choices that previous generations did not have when it comes to that control? And you are free to choose whether or not to have sex. In fact, there are laws against anyone forcing you to make a sexual choice that you don't want. You have a choice, if you do decide to engage in sexual intimacy, of whether or not to become pregnant. If you choose not to get pregnant, you have a wide variety of free, readily available contraceptive methods. And this isn't the time to unpack why natural family planning is preferred. But the point is to remind them you have choices. No one should be forced to raise a child she does not want. No. So you can choose if pregnancy results, if a child is created by your choice to have sex, you can choose to give that child up for adoption. So lots and lots of choices. You have a right to choose. And your right to choose began when you began. Your body, your choice. And your right to choose began when you were in the womb. One final thought about language. Once uttered, a word cannot be taken back. A word once said cannot be unsaid, although I'm sure we've all had times when we could unsay something. And you can apologize all you want, but you can never really erase having said it. While words can be tools, they can also be seeds. I participated in an abortion debate once where I used the word murder, which resulted in an abrupt end to that conversation. The other person literally stood up and stormed off saying, I can't even talk to you. In truth, she could talk to me, but she would not listen to me. My hope and prayer is the utterance of that one word planted a seed which someday, when germinated, may bear fruit for her as to the truth. Here's the thing about language, any kind of language, good or bad, truthful or not. It's of absolutely no use and serves no purpose if people refuse to even come to the table to talk, if they are not open to even hearing words that you may wish to speak. A number of people in my circle of friends and acquaintances here at Blessed Sacrament declined a personal invitation sent out by another member of our circle of friends. They declined to attend because they said they are pro-choice and they have no interest in hearing what might be said here tonight. So language, it can't be a useful tool. There's no one there to hear it. So we're back to our number one tool. The number one tool in that prayer box, in the toolbox, prayer. So can I close my portion with another prayer? May we? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for our sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. As I've shared, I've always had a fascination with language. Our next presenter is a young man who's always been fascinated with history. I believe he is still faithfully making his way chronologically through biographies of all the presidents. Are you up to McKinley? I'm not sure how far you've gone. Van Buren. But he alternates that with these tomes of ancient Greece history and ancient Rome. One of the most amazing people I've ever met, Patrick Kelly.
A show of hands, please. How many of you support slavery? How many of you would have supported slavery if you had been born 200 years ago? How many of you would have been abolitionists if you had been born back in 1822? I'm not sure how many people are tuning into the live stream. There were 17 million people living in the United States by 1838, but there were barely 100,000 abolitionists. That's one out of every 170. Again, I don't know how big the live stream audience is, but I don't see 170 of you out here. So by the law of averages, if you folks had lived during the heyday of American slavery, not a single one of you would have publicly opposed it in any meaningful way. My name is Patrick Kelly. I'm not the leader of any organization. I do not have any formal education on this topic. But as a human being with the capacity for moral reasoning, I'm as qualified to stand before you as anyone else, just as you, by virtue of your own reason, are also qualified to stand up and speak. In his novel Infinite Jest, David Foster Wallace asserted that everybody is identical in their secret, unspoken belief that way deep down they are different than everyone else. When I was in high school, I was pro-choice, and I fit Wallace's description to a T. Now I'm pro-life. The realization that led me to change my mind is that I am not, in fact, special, and I do not live in a special time. Now, I don't mean that I'm not unique in the eyes of the Almighty. I don't mean I have all the same characteristics that other people have. What I mean when I say I'm not special is that I am bound by the same constraints of nature that have bound every other human being for as long as there have been human beings. I have lines on my face these days. They no longer fully disappear once I stop smiling. I have gray in my temples. The lines will deepen and the gray will spread, and eventually my body will give out. Somehow, sooner or later, as the body of every other human being has given out for as long as there have been human beings. And I have no say in the matter. Sure, I can try to eat right and exercise, but none of those decisions really buy me a single day, not with any kind of guarantee attached. No one has ever had a guarantee, because no one gets to control what reality has dictated. And in much the same way that I don't get to pick the depth of the lines on my face, I don't get to decide what sex means. Sex is an act of procreation. It's the act of procreation. And that question has been settled for as long as there have been human beings. Sure, I can put on a condom, she can take a pill, but that doesn't change the nature of what sex is any more than my running an extra mile on the treadmill changes the nature of my mortality. Now, that realization entered my mind about 10 years ago, and it was subtle at first. It flipped a switch inside me quietly. But it radically altered the course of my life, because after I had that realization, I lost the ability to lie to myself. Yes, abortion is wrong because it destroys an innocent human life. But beyond that, it's arrogant. It's arrogant because the pathway it follows to that destruction is an obscene twisting of reality. To pretend that the pleasure of sex and the duty of fatherhood or motherhood are not inextricably bound together is to tell the ultimate lie of modern Western civilization. It is to participate in a grotesque charade. To defy nature through Botox and plastic surgery is one thing. To do so by murdering an unborn child is another thing entirely. I have been told repeatedly that my realization is simplistic, that the nature of being is far more complicated than I made it out to be so far, that there are a lot of factors to consider, that every case is different, that I have no right to dictate the decisions a woman can make with her doctor, that I can't possibly know what it's like to be pregnant, so I therefore have no basis to judge. That if I don't think women have the right to choose abortion, then I had better have some good ideas about how to care for unwanted children. How many am I willing to adopt? All of them? Or am I just a hypocrite? In that way, too, I'm not special, and I do not live in a special time, because moral cowardice has always been a part of human nature for as long as there have been human beings. People have always insisted that things are complicated, that consequences can be divorced from actions, that some humans aren't really human, that is, not when their humanity is inconvenient. And so, 200 years ago, there were countless clever people who would have told you that the nature of the American South's peculiar institution was far more complicated than religious zealots made it out to be, that there were a lot of factors to consider, that you had no right to dictate how people ran their plantations, that you couldn't possibly know what it was like to have a whole community depend on you, so you had no right to judge. That if you didn't think people should be permitted to own slaves, then you had better have some good ideas about how to care for all those uneducated African workers once they gained their freedom. How many were you willing to take in? How many could you afford to set up with their own land, their own oxen, their own farming tools? All of them? Or were you just a hypocrite? Then, as now, more than anything else, the country was brimming over with respectable people who were eager to let you know that they personally opposed the mainstream evil of the day, but they wouldn't dare to impose their personal beliefs on their fellow Americans. Because they were tolerant, they were polite, and they had empathy. Well, in fact, it wasn't complicated. It was just hard. George Washington freed his slaves because it was the right thing to do, but he waited until his death because it was hard. When wealthy Virginian landowner John Payne, father of the woman who would go on to marry the fourth president of the United States and be known as Dolly Madison, set his slaves free, abandoned his plantation holdings, and moved his family to live in relative poverty in a Philadelphia tenement, it wasn't a complicated choice, but you better believe it was awful hard. It's hard to give up comfort and security. It's hard to hear your friends mock you or watch them turn their backs on you. It's hard to do what's right when you're immersed every day in an environment that tells you again and again that that right thing is the province of radicals, kooks, tyrants, zealots, bullies, perverts, and simpletons. And that's why for every 170 people, who looked on the horror of slavery, only one of them had the courage to stand up and say no. Today, the abortion issue isn't complicated. It's just hard. It's hard to stand up when you feel like you stand alone. It's hard to speak out when you know it will alienate your friends, your family, your teachers, or your boss. Just like me, you're not special. You don't live in a special time. You are a human being constrained by nature, filled with fear and doubt, just like me, just like John Payne, just like George Washington. Just like them, you too live in a world filled with lies about what's complicated, about what it means to have empathy, about what it means to have rights. There's another David Foster Wallace quote that applies here. The truth will set you free, but not until it is finished with you. In choosing the truth, you are choosing a path, but you can't refuse the obstacles arrayed before you. You have to go through them. But be an abolitionist now, in spite of all that. Because just because you're not special doesn't mean you don't matter. It doesn't mean you're not unique in the eyes of God. And just because this isn't a special time does not mean it's not critically important. Don't do the right thing because you think it will make you special or because you want to make history. Do it because it's right. Thank you.
I want our speakers to be nearby for a little Q&A here, and I'll just come to you if you're okay by that, unless you want to go up to the podium. But if you have any questions, there's one already. Here we go.
I guess the question for all three, but I'll start with Cecilia. How much weight do you think public opinion will have on the future of this decision, and how important is it to change hearts versus changing laws?
Two good questions. By this opinion, you mean the Dobbs case? I don't think it's direct, right? I'm happy to report that the court is not nearly as politicized as everybody thinks it is. They're reading the law and doing their job, right? What affects people is everyone is affected by their own formation and experiences, right? Including how you approach law will be affected by sort of how you approach the world and texts and how you understand culture and all of those things. I mean, justices are regular people. But when it comes to regular public opinion, most of them, at least when I was there, and certainly some of the courts changed since 2009, but yeah, that really wasn't a big deal. Secondarily, how important is it to change the law, or hearts versus laws? I'm definitely on the hearts side of this campaign. Law matters, right? Law says it both shapes our values and reflects our values, and so laws are important. But when it comes to actually creating a culture of life, the U.S. Supreme Court is very removed from that work. That's the work of those of us in the pews, right? Loving our neighbor and caring for the people who are in need and who are confused and who are scared and who are desperate, which is the vast majority of people who don't really feel like they have a lot of life choices, I think is the paramount work to be done. And there's certainly plenty of it to do, and it's much easier, actually, to do than some of these larger scale changes. And if we change our culture and we change our hearts, then slowly our laws begin to reflect the kind of community that we have.
Anyway.
Just kind of a historical perspective. I think it was Andrew Breitbart said that politics is downstream of culture. How do you change culture? Not through political means. It's kind of the other way around, I think. There is a tendency to think that religiosity has been on a long, slow, gradual decline for the last several hundred years, that people are just getting less and less religious. And it's absolutely true. Fewer people go to church than did, say, 50 years ago. But history doesn't really have a direction, and it wouldn't be accurate to think of this single path we're on, that people have been gradually losing faith. There have actually been, I believe, 4 or 5 distinguishable religious revivals in this country over the past 240 years. So we think of present day as being the least religious. It's not. Church attendance now is actually higher than it was in the late 18th century. All of which is to say, there's 350 million people in this country, and everybody's different. And the conglomeration of all of their viewpoints and their values is what we might call culture. So I think it's about hearts and minds. In my case, I read something in a political journal called National Review, and my mind went first, and then my heart followed after that. And I came up with, basically, I didn't write it down until a couple months ago, but everything in that speech, just kind of, once that switch got flipped, everything flowed from there. And it started as an intellectual exercise, and then my heart came afterwards. Not everybody's like me. I think it's one person at a time, times 100 million. I don't know of any other way.
A couple thoughts. John, you said personal opinion, how that weighs in. And we trust that the different levels and branches of our government will do what they're intended to do, and that is the judicial branch is not to make laws, it's to interpret them. So in that regard, we trust they're going to ignore public opinion on this and stick with a strict adherence and interpretation to the laws. The trend has been in judges other than the Supreme Court, where we see litigation where judges are actually creating new versions and new interpretations. They're actually making laws rather than applying the ones that exist. So it's a slippery slope sometimes in there, and public opinion should not weigh in on it. I think down the road, as Cecilia mentioned, if we need a constitutional amendment post-Roe years, then public opinion will have a part in that, making that happen.
A comment, and I'd like to hear your comment on it. I've been pro-life my whole life, but I also have a lot of people I know who are pro-choice, and I started using that term in the mid-'80s when I read an editorial that said to be in a dialogue on this, and I understand your point about calling it murder, but to begin a dialogue on it, you should at least use the terminology that each one wants to be called. If you turn the person off before you've even gotten the door, then you're not going to really have much of a debate. So I just throw that out there. But the other thing I would say is, in some ways, it was very interesting to hear about the legal parts of it and stuff, but there's still a side of me that says, even if the pro-life side gets what it wants and they overturn this, some people seem like that's the end, but I don't think that it's going to stop things at all. I mean, look at the case with drugs. I don't know if you've noticed it around the city, but drugs are legal, and we have deep, serious prosecution and police authority to try to stop that. And as the Onion headline said, the drug war is over. Drugs won. I mean, they're all over the place, and the laws haven't stopped that. To use that analogy in a little way, just because we make this, whether it would go back to the states and become illegal, there are a huge number of people who believe that the women should have that choice. And it's a lot harder to do, to change all of their minds, but you can have an abortion without people finding out. That happened before the 70s, and it probably will go back to happening that way again. There's also other countries where they could go. We have, freedom of transportation, and Colombia and Ireland both have legalized abortion. So to me, that's what's troubling, is that there's obviously a large number of people who believe that it should be legal. And I've always wrestled with that. I mean, you're going to have to convert those people, one by one. Maybe it's by showing them ultrasounds, maybe it's by engaging in dialogue, but I don't think there's a simple, and the Supreme Court thing isn't simple, but it's a lot simpler than what's got to happen, I think, to stop it. I'd like to hear what you guys think.
Certainly, right, we can understand the legal framework, and I think that's important, and people are going to have conversations about law to understand how the law is actually operating. But I agree with you completely and wholeheartedly that there is nothing preventing us today from doing what we would need to do to create an infrastructure, right, in our homes, in our parishes, in our communities, right, that supports people, that loves them. There's also nothing that keeps us from passing laws that expand people's ability to access support for childcare, right? To support working mothers, to give protections to women who are concerned about sharing parental rights with abusers, right? There are so many different things that drive women to choose abortion that we could help with as communities of love and care, and also structurally by providing greater supports. And it concerns me sometimes to see the amount of energy that goes into overruling a U.S. Supreme Court case versus building the infrastructure. Now, they're not mutually exclusive pathways, but I think that sometimes it's easier to, fight the big dragon than it is to do the hard work of every day actually loving our neighbor. And so I think that you're right, and that is both maybe discouraging insofar as one big win won't solve all problems, and also incredibly hopeful because there's nothing to stop us from creating the culture of life.
Just to kind of stick with my analogy, the Supreme Court ruled that a man named Dred Scott was not a human being. It's a pretty famous decision. The attitude on the Supreme Court, I'm sure we can all agree, has changed. The fact is, if you put slavery to a popular vote 200 years ago, people would have stuck with slavery. If you had put Jim Crow to a national popular vote when the Civil Rights Act was passed, Jim Crow would have won. And yet here we are. And regardless of, people in good faith can disagree about the state of race relations in this country, but when you compare it to the situation under Jim Crow, it's vastly, vastly better. I am reminded of a quote, when you're talking about the drug war's over, drugs won. I think there's merit to that, but I want to read this briefly. This is a quote by T.S. Eliot. If we take the widest and wisest view of a cause, there is no such thing as a lost cause, because there is no such thing as a gained cause. We fight for lost causes because we know that our defeat and dismay may be the preface to our successor's victory, though that victory itself will be temporary. We fight rather to keep something alive than in the expectation that anything will triumph. So I'm kind of in line with that viewpoint. keeping alive the idea that personhood extends before birth, and kind of keeping your head down and fighting to win one person at a time instead of being focused to the exclusion of everything else. Okay, how many Supreme Court justices do we need? How many more states do we need? At the end of the day, it's got to be one person at a time. And my perspective as someone who was pro-choice for half my life and then changed based on just this one little thing I read, I have to believe that if I can change, a lot of other people can change too.
That was an interesting point. Thank you for making that. Where it reminds me of a conversation I had just recently. I don't have any sisters, but I have a cousin who's like a sister, and she's known nationally in the Lutheran Church for her work in the liturgy. She writes music, and she's written a Christian play, 5,000 for Supper for kids. So she's very prominent in her faith, a woman of faith. But she said to me recently, and she's my cousin, so she can't completely sever a relationship with me. But she said she started out with saying, well, she's both pro-choice and pro-life. So I tried to have her stick to definitions. But she said, as you pointed out, if abortion is banned, if it's illegal, there will still be women who get abortions. But she said the wealthy women will always be able to get an abortion, even if it's illegal, where the poor women can't. Therefore, we need to keep it legal. So if you use that reasoning, that's like saying if you're really smart, you can figure out a way to embezzle from your company. But if you're not as smart, you won't be able to figure that out. Therefore, everybody should be able to embezzle. So what it comes down to is the relativism that starts creeping in. If we decide the bottom line is murder, as Patrick said, it can be complicated, but it also is very simple in that murder is wrong. And it somehow, as a race, if we can't fight for, even if it's a lost cause, that's what makes us human. If we can't agree to some basic decency of natural law, then we're kind of lost. So regardless of whether this is going to happen or not, I mean, just like now in so many cities where people are vandalizing, stealing from stores, and this growing theory of, well, they need that, we're not going to prosecute. So now we're saying, history of humanity, it's wrong to take something that doesn't belong to you, and now we're going to say, well. So I think we need to decide on some truths. Murder is wrong, stealing is wrong, and we have to stick to them regardless of other people who may find their way around them, or we've really lost who we are as humans. And I'm sorry, I continue to go on.
So my question is actually directed at Professor Klingel. So if the court does overturn Casey and or Roe, do you think that the court will completely remove the frameworks that they've set up with the viability, or potentially bring back the trimester framework when they release their decision in June or whenever it does come out? Or do you think that they'll just completely let that go back to the states?
Thanks. So the U.S. Supreme Court actually only has authority to tell states what to do on matters of constitutional law and federal law. So if they were to decide that they don't actually there's no constitutional right at issue in this case, then they wouldn't have the power to say anything, right? So it would just all go away, and then the states would make their own decisions.
Thanks, and I want to just reference the point that you made about the work really beginning, or I should say accelerating at a rapid pace if the court overturns Roe. The beautiful thing, and I think it's really been erroneously reported, that the pro-life movement has not been giving its all on every front to reach every woman who needs assistance. In our community, we have pregnancy care centers that this parish and other churches support generously. And many people in this room, I think, have gone out of their way to do exactly that, to create a culture of life in our own communities. But the law is a great moral teacher. The law changes hearts. There are many women who have had abortions who, looking back, have said, I rationalized my decision by saying if it was wrong, it wouldn't be legal. And unfortunately, they now have to live with that, the ramifications of that decision. Bad things always continue. Human beings are imperfect. We don't get rid of every law on the books because those things continue. The human spirit is the human spirit, and we all struggle and sin. And there will continue to be abortions, and more abortions are happening now in pill form. And the current administration just lifted restrictions so that those pills can arrive in your mailbox. And so more abortions will be happening at home, which also means that more women will see their babies. Where right now they go into a clinic, and if they choose not to see the ultrasound, they never have to look at the ramifications of the choice that they're making. And many women who have chemical abortions see their babies. And that's a whole nother realm of suffering and healing. But I really just want to say that the beauty of the pro-life movement is there's a place for everyone. And I think right now we need to be prepared, and we need to be on our knees asking God, where do we fit in? Because some might be called to political action, some might be called to pregnancy resource work, some might be called to making sure that there are child care options and a foundation. There's not one way to be pro-life. Some may be called to be on their knees more than we already are for so many different reasons. But this is a real pivotal time, and many observers believe, although the court has surprised us in the past, that Roe versus Wade will likely be overturned, which means our opportunities to be ambassadors for life in whatever way God's calling us to be are going to be plentiful. And I think it's a really great time for discussions like this so that we can ask God to prepare us now for how we can find that place in the movement, because there is something that every single one of us can do.
I just want to make a reminder also that I read in the newspaper, one of the letters that's always entertaining for me, I call it the funny pages, that the pro-life movement does not, they need to step up. You said that. Oh, you need to step up. You need to start, bringing diapers to the diaper drive. And I'm like laughing because we did 26,000 diapers, which is over 1 month for the pregnancy helpline from just one parish alone. One parish and school did that. So sometimes it's simply we're not hearing each other on some of the realities that are there, and we are taking care of them.
Talking about these difficult situations, how women suffer, how we try to help them, it can be a bit of a downer, right? But I want to share one really life-giving thing that we're doing in our diocese. It's called Walking with Moms in Need. And every parish is being asked to answer a survey of what they do to help women in need survive thrive, and become whole. So, if you are not a member of Blessed Sacrament and you haven't heard of this yet, I would really like to talk to you. We are doing it across the diocese. We're having trainings, 2 more trainings this month, and more will be coming until we have every parish trained to find the resources that women need. So, in a way, we're trying to fill the gap. But then the next step for interested people will be, what are the extra things we need to do? And that's going to be the exciting phase of this. So if childcare is needed, or transportation, or jobs, we want to get that identified and start filling those gaps. I just didn't want to have you leave feeling downhearted that there's so much left to do. There is, but we are already doing it. It's not just our diocese, it's across the whole nation. Every diocese is being asked to identify what they do to help women in need. So these, hopefully this will expand to other churches. Right now it's amongst the Catholic churches, but you know, good ideas can flourish. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand this back to Father Andy. I see another question.
I'm a lover of politics, and so I spent 10 years of my life actually being a lobbyist, and so I want to extend an invitation to people to consider joining a couple of groups. One is Democrats for Life. If you're more of a Democratic persuasion, because pro-life Democrats really need an organized, cohesive voice in our political landscape. The other is the American Solidarity Party, which, as far as I can tell, has a platform that is 100% consistent with the teachings of the Catholic Church. And I also want to just invite all of us to have an expansive view of what it means for a politician to be pro-life. The 3 biggest reasons that women have abortions are lack of financial resources, lack of access to child care, and lack of access to health care. It has been Democrats, not Republicans, that are fighting to increase the minimum wage. It's been Democrats, not Republicans, for the last 10 years in Wisconsin that have been trying to expand Medicaid coverage, and it's been Republicans that have fought that. And it's been Democrats, not Republicans, that are fighting for expansion of mandatory child care or paid leave, paid parental leave. And so while they may not be saying that they are pro-life, those Democrats that are fighting for those things, they're fighting for the things that allow women to choose life. And conversely, Republicans may say they're pro-life, but they're actively opposing the very things that women need in order to choose life. So we need better choices as voters, I think. And so that's why I mentioned those 2 organizations that I think are working to advocate for better choices when we go to the ballot box.
About 4 minutes. We'll wrap it up at about 8:30.
A few years ago, we had a presentation here about similar issues, and the statistic that I heard then by a panel was, and I don't know your source, but the statistic that I heard was the number one, and I guess this depends on your exit polling of who you ask and if they're honest, but the number one reason women have abortions is, one, they're not ready for it. Either they're too young, it interrupts school, their career, and secondly, their family's complete. And then the other reasons are valid as far as financial needs, but they're farther down the line. So I guess we can find statistics just about anywhere. But it was interesting, though, when you say, and I understand what, the point about if you're really pro-life, then you'd care more about child care and health care, et cetera. But this is where I go back to, yes, that's true, but in our culture and in our discussion, we have decided the word pro-life is what we're talking about. Should abortion be legal or illegal? So those are all important social issues to help alleviate financial need and hardship, et cetera. But when you get into that language, this is where, again, I say, for our discussion, we're saying pro-life right now are people who say abortion should be illegal.
I would just add that there is a logical distinction to be made between whether thinking something is a positive good on the one hand, which in many ways the left and the right are in alignment. Should people be able to go to the doctor? Yes, of course. Should people be able to get care for their children? Of course. There's a distinction between that and the means by which those things are provided. So the fact that one person seeks to provide those things through national central planning, and another person argues that the best way to make those things available to the most number of people is through more of a free market system, doesn't mean that person A wants it and person B doesn't.
We're almost at 8:30, and probably you're getting hungry for some Lenten chocolate chip cookies and some drinks and whatnot. But I want to thank everyone for coming out, and thank you, Cecilia, Linda, and Patrick for your great talks as we continue on this. A lot of hard work in continuing this, and because we're in a church and I'm a priest, I can tell you the little piece that I do, which is that the preacher in me, and the preacher here. There's a couple of sources that I draw from deeply when it comes to call yourself a Christian, is to remember that the earliest teachings of the apostles was called the Didache. And in the Didache, it speaks very clearly that you don't see this in Scripture, but they clearly taught, the earliest Christians, no infanticide before or after the child is born. This is a long, long reality of our Christian heritage that goes all the way back, even a little bit farther, because abortion is as old as human beings. We've been like that for a long time. But the one that always gets me every year about Christmas time with our little mangers out there is when she heard the sound of her voice, the baby in her womb leaped for joy. As we know, that was John the Baptist in the womb of Elizabeth, who heard the voice of Mary, a voice that also a person made in the image and likeness of God. And at the end of the day, that's what we're fighting for. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. The Lord be with you. And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Go have something to eat and chat and continue the conversation and continue our work. God bless.
You'll be even more special.
I see you every once in a while at Trader Joe's. Yeah, it is. It surely is. Just think, there was even thought of putting a Walgreens in there. Oh boy. We said no.